Ioan Grillo, you are a British journalist. You
Yeah,
have been reporting on Latin America since the year 2001. That makes already 20 years. You have
yeah.
been reporting for international media, including Time Magazine, Reuters, CNN, and the list is so long, I'm just not going to mention all of them. Your first book was El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, which was translated in 5 languages. Your second book was Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America, which was also well received by readers. And today we're here to talk about your latest book, Blood, Gun, Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. Ioan, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
So, Ioan, the first impression that I have is that you live a dangerous life. I mean, you are a journalist, and of course, journalists, they are nowadays risking their life more and more when they are reporting about critical issues other than fashion. And even fashion could be dangerous from time to time. So, my first question is, well, you are a British journalist. How come you ended up in Mexico? Shouldn't you be reporting on Boris Johnson or something related to the Queen? What was the what was the scene that led you to a place like Mexico?
Yeah, so my journey here, as you say, was 20 years ago. I arrived here 21 years ago at the end of the year 2000. And I was just getting into journalism then. I mean, late, I was 27 years old. And I had the idea of doing foreign journalism. I already lived in Spain for a year, so I spoke Spanish. And I traveled already quite a lot. I'd spent some time in the Middle East and some different places. And, I loved the idea of Latin America then. Didn't know Latin America. And originally I wasn't interested in the drug angle as much, the drug gangster angle. I was kind of looking more at the aspirations of left-wing government in Latin America and that kind of thing, the kind of Che Guevara, the military dictatorships. That was the kind of narrative, the stories of Latin America I was thinking about. But very quickly when I arrived here in the year 2000, I ran right into this story about drug trafficking and immediately related to me because I grew up in the southeast of England near a city called Brighton, in an area with a huge amount of drug consumption. And back in the 1980s, growing up, there was a huge amount of drugs around me, and various people I knew, teenagers and young men, died of drug overdoses, particularly heroin. And so it kind of, for me, it was interesting to make this connection between the drug consuming cultures in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, and the drug producing and trafficking countries. Now it's more complicated because, Mexico itself has a lot of drug consumption as well, or Brazil has a lot of drug consumption. But that was very interesting, that connection. And I kind of began on this journey then. Originally had the idea of just staying in Mexico for a couple of years. I've been here 20 years now. And as I was pursuing this journey, Mexico, it went from a crime story to this humanitarian catastrophe, to a situation with hundreds of thousands of dead, with things I couldn't have imagined covering, with mass graves, with piles of decapitated bodies. This insane story we're covering, or this insane situation we're covering. And so it became a lot of global interest in this for a while. It became quite a hot global story, particularly around 2010, 2011. And I carried on through it, and the kind of through covering this situation.
Okay, so if we think of the root of the problem, many people will go to Mexico or Colombia, where I'm from. But the root of the problem, in fact, is the US, Europe, all these consumer countries. If there was not such a big consumption, there wouldn't be a supply. Now, I'm from Colombia, and I know there's drugs everywhere, but the typical Colombian is not a drug user. And to a period not long ago, the typical Mexican was not a drug user. All the drugs was produced for export to the US and Europe. So my question is, what is it in the culture of these countries that make it so appealing to consume drugs?
Well, that's a great question to start off, taking it back to me growing up in a drug consuming culture. Although tragically now you have seen a lot of drug consumption grow within Mexico. And part of that's connected to the drug trade, because you pay somebody, instead of paying them in cash, you pay them with a brick of cocaine. And then they just move that on the street and start, or pay them in crystal meth. And they move that on the street and start creating local markets. But about drug consumption, if we look at drug consumption in Europe and the United States, then this really exploded from the 1960s onwards. That was when you saw sudden, you had drug consumption, way back, and we've had it right through, if you talk about Britain, right through British history back to people taking magic mushrooms in the days of druids and stuff. But the modern drug consumption era really starts in the 1960s, really explodes. And it's connected to the counterculture, the whole thing of people see drugs, there's this way of connected to kind of freedom and connected to youth and connected to kind of, sex and music and this kind of thing. And then when cocaine makes its big splash, which really affects Colombia in the 1970s, and you have the famous time when Time magazine has, the all-American drug on the cover, and you have, these situations you have it in cinema, scenes with Woody Allen. I remember a famous scene in cinema when Woody Allen sneezes on this big amount of cocaine in the movie Annie Hall, I think it is. Stories about American football teams who are all taking lines of cocaine before they go on to win, the Super Bowl and this kind of thing. So I think in some ways it gets marketed really, really well. I mean, if you could find, give somebody a prize for marketing in the 20th century, then cocaine would be the big prize. I mean, the fact that cocaine, people would pay up to $200 a gram for this stuff. Sometimes a lot of places $100, stuff that's cut, but a couple $100, $100, $150 for a little gram of this stuff. And then with cocaine, the fact that it's a sexy drug, that somebody can say to a girl in a party, you want to come to the bathroom with me to take some cocaine? You couldn't say that with glue. Also, the fact that this way that this drug got marketed. But also with drugs, as well as the kind of consumer side, the kind of big recreational side that's shown off in music and stuff, you then had all of the hard drugs, heroin, crack cocaine, crystal meth. And in the United States right now, we have this huge, huge problem with opioids. But also, where I grew up, there was friends, people I knew with real bad addiction problems. Now that gets into, I think, deeper questions about society, about how people deal with problems. You have to look at, I've got friends who work in rehab who say that a lot of the people have their own personal problem of abuse. Often that you have some real trauma that and so you turn to drugs. But there are other things, some of the people I knew who became really bad addicts. It's kind of hard to pinpoint sometimes what are their real problems, what are their causes, how do they fall into that? There's different personalities. In my own family, we have a lot of, my own extended family and my family going back, we have a lot of problems with alcoholism in my family. So why is it some people have that problem? Why are some people susceptible to that? And then there are deep questions we have to look at. I think part of the answers is a certain change in society, a certain lack of meaning in society, a certain lack of structure, a certain lack of strong relationships. I think that's part of the issue, but these are quite deep things to get into.
Okay, and the other thing, your latest book is Blood, Gun, Money.
Yeah.
And I wonder also, what is America's adoration for guns. I mean, there are guns in my country, but usually there's are things that basically only criminals have for nefarious purpose, or maybe someone in a farm for self-defense against animals. But you know, in the United States, you have all these cabinets full of guns, and people who are not criminal, they really, really love their guns. And I don't understand where does that come from. And of course, this adoration from guns creates as oversupply, and then the exportation and the black market, some things that you talk about in your book. But I just don't understand why so much adoration for these toys.
Yeah, Americans love guns. That's a phrase you kind of hear, and it's, you know, true for America, true for the United States in a way it's not true for really anywhere else in the world. I also went to Serbia, partly to look at Serbia is kind of known to kind of gun-loving country, but I found that there's no comparison between Serbia and the United States. I mean, Serbia actually, they've got quite strong restrictions on guns now, and you know there are a lot of firearms around, but nothing like the US. Yemen is cited as a big gun-loving country, and that's like you know, a completely different case out there. I think there's a few things around the American love for guns, which is not among all Americans. It's among maybe not even a majority of Americans now. They say that gun ownership actually has gone down. The number of firearms in the United States has gone consistently up. And now we've got maybe 400 million firearms in the United States. More firearms in the hands of civilians than the next 25 countries combined in the United States. But they say that the actual percentage of Americans who own guns used to be about half. Now it's down to about a third. A lot of those guns then go into individual, the population itself has grown, but also they go into individual collections, just getting bigger and bigger. So I have one guy interviewed for the book, and he's not a wild exception. He's a guy who has 200 guns in his basement. Wow. You know, and this is a tax lawyer. With 200 firearms in his basement, and he's part of the Alaska Machine Gun Association, going around firing full automatic machine guns in Alaska. So that kind of love of firearms, or the passion, I think it has these different things which make a cocktail. So on one side, you have people who are kind of extreme hobbyists. I mean, real hobbyists. They just really into the. They love talking about guns. They love guns. They love taking guns apart. They love collecting a whole bunch of different weapons. They love firing them and know everything about them. So they're kind of extreme hobbyists. You know, we have a lot of extreme hobbyists in England. People who really just get really into stuff. You know, our friends who are really into records, really into Lego, you know, really into, you know, whatever. They're really into firearms in that way. So that's one thing. The second element I think you see is the sporting element. People just really, really into the sport of shooting, of hunting. Not everyone's into hunting, but you know, some of them are into hunting. Those who are into hunting, some of them see that as being this kind of connection, you know, of killing animals. Although some of them do these things like shooting bears, which are like pretty, you know, not that, you know, incredible skill involved. So then you have, as well as the sport thing, you then have, which can also be addictive, like a computer game. You know, you go and you practice shooting, and you try and get better and better. Another thing is the idea of self-defense, and that's a very, very big, powerful idea, which has a certain amount of truth to it, and there's also critiques of that. But the idea of having firearms to defend themselves with crime, with mugging, with anything, burglary, and also, you know, riots or whatever. And the fourth big element is the political element of guns representing freedom and the Second Amendment and this idea. So the four can combine together. I think in a lot of the people I talk to, who are the kind of firearms Second Amendment defenders, they had all four of these elements, you know, some of them to different levels. And it became a very, very powerful conviction. And for some of the real radical people, it can become, you know, quite fanatic. To other people, it can become quite nuanced, quite a nuanced thing.
Wow. Okay, about your private life, I mean, you are reported about these sensitive subjects. I mean, I'm sure not everyone is happy about the content of your books, and you live in Mexico City.
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel any kind of fear for your life? I mean, you have reported in your own books that Mexicans, I mean, people involved in drugs, they don't hesitate twice before taking some kind of violent action. And you are kind of opening the kimono and showing the whole world what is going on. I mean, tell us about your situation there.
Well, a couple of things about this. I mean, the first thing is that Mexican journalists have suffered a horrific attacks on Mexican journalists over the last 20 years that I've been here. The numbers, there's different counts, but some of the counts, but over 150 Mexican journalists have been murdered in the 20 years that I've been here. Two of them I've known personally, or one who was murdered, Javier Valdez in Sinaloa, another guy who disappeared, Mauricio in Petzingan, Michoacan. And so I don't want to, in a way, dramatize my own case too much in the face of so much problems there's been for Mexican journalists and Mexican press. But in terms of reporting on this, yeah, sure, it's difficult. Sure, it's problematic, like any conflict, like many things in the world. But in a way, I think, I mean, if we look at the problems for journalists and journalism right now, the problem of violence against journalists is a big part of this. I think for many of us who choose to go and cover some of these, you know, to fly to places and to cover these stories, and I get to travel around. I've had the luck, the privilege of traveling around many parts of Latin America, Colombia, your beautiful country, Haiti, Brazil, Honduras, Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, all these places. Travel there and go into these situations, and I think those of us who do that and have the privilege of doing that and the luck to be able to do that and tell these stories, then we accept the risks. And I think if people don't, and if you have sometimes colleagues on jobs who are really, really scared, and I think you have to say, well, you know, there's a lot of people want to go and do this. So we have to go there and accept the risk, like a fireman accepts the risk, like a coal miner accepts the risk, and all these things. However, there are also, I think it's a bit different for the journalists in the small towns in Mexico, where they're kind of often reporting for these local newspapers, local radio stations, and the war has really come to them and really come on top of them, and they've got no freedom to even walk around their neighborhood without running into the people who are there they're reporting on. So they're kind of really on the front line there. But also, I think the deeper problems for journalism are things like the economic base of journalism has been shattered by this sudden change. We're in a very new media environment, so we've got to try and rebuild and find the economic. There still is some money around. You have to really hustle hard to find money to do this and to keep on doing this kind of work. That's a hard hustle now. And and it's and trying to find ways of doing that. So that's a huge challenge. But also, what I'm worried about, and I think journalists should be worried about, is the kind of way. I mean, various problems in the media, the lack of the breakdown of trust between much of the media and the public, or much of the public. I think that's something we need to really work on and repair as well. And how to navigate this whole new tech environment in terms of, the freedom of speech issues and all of these things. So these are huge challenges for journalism as well as the issue of being out there in the field, running around after drug cartels.
Wow. Just out of my own curiosity, I'm from Colombia, but I have
Yeah,
been decades in Canada, so I'm
yeah,
kind of out of the loop. What
yeah,
is Colombia's place in this drug trade now? Because when I was growing up, I know that we were considered the drug capital of the world, but I think
yeah,
it's my impression that Mexico have taken that title now.
yeah. So what year did you leave Colombia?
I it was about 40 years ago, so in the 1990s.
Okay. So Colombia, you know, was, I mean, it wasn't just the fact that it was a huge amount of cocaine. You know, was the dominant player in cocaine and has been for most of the last 40 years. I mean, you know, it was the violence in Colombia. So the violence in Colombia, the destabilization of the whole Colombian state, the Colombian country, and the horrible things that happened, how that affected everyone's life. So the kind of real terror and violence that Colombia lived through in the 1990s. And that was pushed back um, due to various reasons, partly from the government with this US-backed Plan Colombia. There's a lot of criticism about this, about human rights violations, and very valid criticisms. But under the Colombian governments, there was a weakening of the guerrillas in Colombia, the FARC, and so they kind of pushed back, and eventually the peace deal was made. And so you still have the FARC around, the guerrillas around, but they're more, you know, the ex-guerrillas now, or some still active kind of fighting guerrillas or whatever, you know, who are just involved in drug trafficking, or some of them still, you know, with the kind of dream of the revolution. But they're a lot more pushed out now. So a lot of the center of the country is kind of recaptured by the state in that sense. And with the drug traffickers themselves, so you had a lot of the big drug traffickers in Colombia were knocked down. You know, so you had obviously Pablo Escobar taken down, shot dead in 1993. Then the Cali cartel became the big players, and then they were taken down. Then you had like Norte del Valle, you know, Cartel del Valle, all this kind of thing, and then they hit those. So there was these big attacks with the US and the Colombian security forces working together and bringing down the traffickers in Colombia, and using a lot of the laws that became very aggressive US laws. You know, people in Latin America thought, oh, it's okay, look, I'm not going to the United States. Why do I have a problem? I'm just going to make the cocaine and then sell it on. But then they had the law, well, if you're making cocaine, then you're in a conspiracy to traffic that cocaine to Americans, and we're still going to use the charges to go down there and get you and extradite you to the United States even, and put you in a US jail. So all of these things hit the Colombian traffickers pretty hard. So what the Colombian traffickers did was the whole business changed, the whole business model changed. And instead of being these high profile warlords, what I call gangster warlords, they went down to being much more secretive kind of cellular players. So you've got people still in the business. You've still got plenty of cocaine coming out of Colombia. But you've got these, you know, these groups, you know, you've got groups who are like involved in like different activities along the line, and making their money and stashing their money and moving it a bit more cleverly. So they're not like these big, you know, gangster warlords. You still have got some gangster warlords in Colombia, and you've still got particularly this group called the Gulf Clan, who I in fact profile a bit in my new book because of their involvement in firearms trafficking as well into Colombia. But so the players went down there, and the cocaine is still moving out now. Mexico, on the other hand, you had the rise of these big gangster warlords moving the cocaine in and taking the real lion's share of that money, but also getting into crystal meth in a massive way, heroin in a massive way, fentanyl in a massive way, and still making money off marijuana even now. And getting into a whole bunch of other businesses in Mexico. So Mexico becoming the kind of focal point in the world's view of kind of drug cartel violence. But the Colombians are still moving cocaine to the United States and also to Europe. I mean, a lot of cocaine from there going to Europe, still a lot of money, moving hands in that business.
Wow. Okay, so let's go to your book, Blood, Gun, Money. How does America arms gangs and cartels in Mexico and all over the world?
Yeah, so this book, I mean, I've been covering this for 20 years, and I've been following the gun issue for some time, and the guns coming from the United States. I mean, from my early days here, I was doing stories about it. But it became more and more of a thought about, you know, really, how is this working? How is the gun trafficking business working? Because part of what I'd done with trying to understand the drug trafficking business was trying to make sense of the business of drug trafficking. You know, where you kind of go to Colombia, you buy a kilo of cocaine, or, you know, you start off growing coca leaves in you know, in Cauca, or, you know, in Colombia, and then you kind of convert those into a kilo of cocaine, and then kind of bring them up, and all along the chain, exactly how that business works. So I was interested, how does the gun business work? And what's the connection, not only between the violence in Mexico and guns in the United States, but guns in the US itself as well, and guns moving around into the inner cities of the United States, guns in, you know, in crime there, guns in mass shootings, all of these things, as well as, you know, it's a lot of kind of spirals there. So I really looked into this over a bunch of years to understand the gun trafficking business. You know, what's the gun trafficking business? And it's very different from the drug trafficking business, but it's also very connected. So first, what I found was, if you imagine this kind of like these noxious plants growing up the side of a house, they're like entwined, the gun trafficking business and the drug trafficking business. Now, drugs make huge money, illegal drugs. You're talking, I mean, according to the United Nations, over $300 billion a year worldwide. Could be a lot more, you know, we don't know. The US White House, a study called What Americans Spend on Illegal Drugs, talks about $150 billion spent by Americans on illegal drugs every year. Now, illegal gun market is way less than that. But illegal guns are something which, you know, you buy them, it allows you to win and control the drug business. So you have the connections everywhere. So if you go to, like, you know, you look in Mexico, who's moving guns, it's all so often connected to drug cartels and drug trafficking business, the gun trafficking business. But if you look in the United States as well, if you look in, you know, I did a lot of field work in Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. And you have all of these guns trafficked in there from various states, including Georgia, including Virginia. And it's so often connected to drugs. So it's this kind of often a barter. You know, someone will bring in guns, someone's selling drugs. Like, I'll exchange drugs and guns with you. And so this looks at this issue, and you have this legal firearms business. So unlike drugs, you know, heroin business is all illegal. Cocaine business is all illegal. So in the cocaine business, you manufacture that kilo of cocaine illegally, you traffic it illegally, and you sell it illegally. So it's all three stages of the economic pipeline. It's illegal. The gun trafficking business, meanwhile, most of these guns are made legally in gun factories. So you have a legal manufacture and a legal business, and then a parallel black market illegal business of guns. So the guns then cross this line into the illegal market. And you see that. So, you know, I trace particular guns in this book. One gun, for example, that was manufactured in Romania in a factory for AK-47s, was taken to the United States, imported by a company based with a big warehouse in Vermont, registered in Florida, but the biggest warehouse in Vermont. Taken in, imported. Then the gun was sold in a gun shop in Texas to somebody, where it then crossed into the black market, was taken part of an order to a drug dealer in Baytown, Texas, and then taken down to the Zetas cartel in Mexico, and then used in his murder in Mexico. I look at of an American agent in that particular case. So you see this interconnections between the legal market and the illegal market. You also see something which is interesting, is that people have looked at guns over the years. It tends to kind of be in two categories, or arms trafficking tends to be looked at in two ways. There's the kind of arms trafficking to wars idea. So how are guns arriving in Syria? How are guns arriving in Libya when that was at war, and that kind of thing. And you have the domestic kind of gun selling, how guns end up in the in the streets of Toronto, or of Vancouver, or of London, or Mexico City. But actually, I found these things are very interlinked. So you find often the routes are interlinked, the same factories, and even the same players at times. So you see, for example, that you have guns being moved around to inner cities in the United States, combining with these criminals, tapping into these markets, but then also taking them to the war in Colombia. So I also looked at, I've got a story of a guy I interviewed in prison in the United States who was flying firearms they were getting trafficked from the United States to Mexico, then he was flying them from Mexico to Colombia. And he was like, what do they want? Because also it's the business. If you're flying cocaine up from Colombia to Mexico, you don't, why fly back with an empty plane? So it's, it's that business of keeping these things moving.
Wow. So let's say that I live in Texas, okay?
Yeah.
And I am allowed to go to a gun store and buy, I don't know, a pistol, okay?
Yeah.
Can I take that pistol and then later sell it to a Mexican, I guess, illegally? And if that's so, what prevents me from buying 100 pistols or 1,000 pistols? Is that possible?
Yeah, yes. It's possible and being done. So you have a few things here. So you have, there's four main ways of guns going into the black market. So one way, the first way is what you call a straw buyer, a straw purchaser. Now, straw purchasers say, I am a criminal and I want to get a gun, and you're a regular, clean American citizen. So I go to you and I say, go and buy me a gun in your name with your ID, and then give it to me. And I'm going to give you $100. Now, what's kind of crazy is that people do this all the time for like $100. Now, why would somebody do that for $100? The reason is because the problems they run into are very, very low for doing that. The actual crime is not buying the gun for somebody else. That's not the crime. The crime is when you fill out the form, there's a question that says, is the gun for you? And they say yes. So the crime is lying on the form. And most time, by definition, if it's somebody without a criminal record or without a felony offense, so they're going to go in there, okay, they can do a background check, they've got no felony, they can sell them the gun. And then the recommended is probation. So they're not getting any prison time. And a lot of the time they're not, you're not going to get caught. So that's why they often pay them $100. That's the first thing. Now there's certain situations where, I've looked at cases where somebody's walked into a shop and bought 10 AK-47s in a straw purchase. Now, in certain states now, that rings an alarm bell. Didn't used to even in border states. Now in border states, that rings an alarm bell, and now they have to, call up the A.T.F. and say there's. But in various states, that's not the case. So you can still walk into a store and buy 10 AK-47s. They can sell it, and it's not. It doesn't set an alarm bell. So you think of that kind of thing. That's kind of like why would and 10 AK-47s are identical models. I mean, like I'm going to go and I'll have 10 of those, please. Now, why would somebody as a regular hobbyist want 10 of the same gun? So that's the first thing. The second thing is what's known as the private sale loophole, which also is sometimes a bit wrongly called the gun show loophole. And that is that if you sell a weapon as a private sale, the idea is that I've got an old gun, I don't want it anymore, I'm going to sell it to my friend. It's a private deal between the two of us. Like if I sell you my old cell phone, if I sell you my car, a private deal, no paperwork done, no ID required. Now that makes sense in those kind of small sales, but also you've got people who exploit that to sell guns and are really in the business. Now, I got this on tape from a gun show I went to, and we went and recorded undercover the conversations. I've also seen court records of this and various statements of this. There's people who will use this and go to gun shows as private sellers, but really be selling large amounts of firearms. So they're exploiting this thing, exploiting this kind of loophole in the law. And this is what gets to the idea of universal background checks being needed. Then the third method that guns are acquired, not so much for the trafficking abroad because they don't need to, but you see it a bit more in terms of guns moving around the United States, is theft of firearms. It's a relatively small percentage, but there are cases, guns being traced that are stolen. And sometimes it's for, people walk right into gun shops and steal weapons, and there's a video of this going in, and they're not even locked. And the crazy thing is that with so many other things, like pharmacies, exploded, you have tight laws about how they should be locked up. With guns, they're not there. There's no federal laws there. So they walk in there, no lock safe, take it out, bunch of guns in the bag, bang, take them out. And that also provides. Then the fourth method now, as a growing method, is the issue of ghost guns, which also is an issue of guns coming to Mexico, coming to Latin America. And ghost guns, not guns that are completely 3D printed, because guns that are completely 3D printed aren't effective at the moment, or cheap ones are not effective at the moment. They tend to be guns that, there might be some components 3D printed, but generally they're different parts of the gun bought in kits off the internet. And again, people buy, there's a case in Mexico where they're buying, and guns like the Brazil are buying hundreds or thousands of these things, and then taking them, moving them over the border, reassembling them south of the border into full weapons. But also right now in Los Angeles, there are a lot of these ghost guns turning up. And I was in Los Angeles, and one of the A.T.F agents there talked about 30 to 40% of the guns they're now seizing off the street being these ghost guns, or what they call unserialized firearms. Wow. So that's a fourth thing. So there's these four big ways that black market guns can get into the flow there.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. Wow, amazing. One last question. So many states are legalizing drugs, marijuana, and I don't know the situation in Mexico, but I think Mexico is also legalizing cannabis. Yeah. So has this reduced in any way, first of all, the traffic of drugs, and secondly, by consequence, the traffic of guns?
So we've had the legalization of marijuana happening in the US since 2012. Before then with medical marijuana, but 2012, you see the first pop of Washington State and Colorado legalized recreational cannabis. And then since then, we've seen it in California, we've seen it in a whole bunch of US states. In Mexico, we're very close to seeing an approval of a law legalizing marijuana here. There's certainly been a decline in the exporting of marijuana from Mexico to the United States now, because of the growth, because it's legal, people creating it legally. Also, in some legal states, some states where it is legal, they also create an excess there and then take to other states. And in the US, the whole legal market has created people with wanting more designer marijuana rather than the kind of bog standard marijuana that often comes out of Mexico. They want the kind of Jake Herrera with their THC listed, rather than just some bunch of marijuana from somewhere in the mountains in the Sierra Madre. I'm not criticizing Mexican marijuana. I'm saying, I mean, actually, that marijuana is too strong. But like, unfortunately, so you see less marijuana come from Mexico. You see that in seizures on the borders, a lot less marijuana now crossing over. Unfortunately, this hasn't reduced the violence or the gun trafficking. And I think the reasons being that these cartels are involved in all the other drugs as well. So you're also involved in crystal meth, heroin, cocaine. And they're involved in a bunch of other crimes, stealing oil, controlling the undocumented migrants going to the United States, prostitution, product piracy, extortion, kidnapping,
Wow.
wildcat mining, any illegal activity you can imagine. Now, eventually, when you start, I mean, you still have marijuana being a business now. So you still have people growing marijuana illegally. So eventually, when it becomes a fully legal business, that might reduce some of the tentacles of organized crime here. But you've still got a phenomenal problem. So it becomes a hard question about what you do with the other drugs, and that is a hard challenge, huge challenge. What do you do about heroin, cocaine, crystal meth?
And do you have any suggestions for a solution to, to reduce all these problems?
So, I believe in drug policy reform. I mean, drug policy reform is, I think, it's kind of in a way of looking at this problem, first of all. If we go back to when the war on drugs, the prohibition of drugs was kicked in under Richard Nixon, he talked about this in very absolutist terms. So he said, we can see the abolition of drugs from American life. That was a phrase that he used. He actually said there will be no drugs. There will be no heroin. There will be no problem for your family because there will be no heroin out on the streets. And obviously that goal has failed. 50 years later, we can see the experience that's failed now. So first of all, we have to accept you're not going to make all drugs go away unless you had a very authoritarian, really authoritarian ways of doing that. If you wanted to do it really in a really authoritarian way, which civil society doesn't want. Then we have to accept there is a problem that drugs are going to be trafficked, a certain amount, but we have to try and reduce the harm of this. It's about harm reduction. So that harm reduction begins with, we have to look at why and help people who become drug addicts, who suffer from problematic drug use. And that means everyone who's a problematic drug user needs help or needs to be offered help. Now, there was a report by the American Medical Association that says that of the people who have problematic drug use, only about 10% are getting the help that they need. So 90% aren't. So we've already got a huge place to start. We're saying, okay, now each one, if it is people who are taking heroin, who are buying heroin or taking crystal meth that come from Mexico, so they're spending all that money, each one of them spends a lot of money on drugs. Now everyone, so you've got one person, a heroin addict that could be spending, a couple of $1,000 a week plus. There's, people could spend huge amounts on drugs. They could easily be spending $100,000 a year on heroin. And that's $100,000 a year going down to the cartels and paying for the assassins and paying for all of this, violence and corruption south of the border. So so you've got a huge place to start there with trying to get some of those addicts off the drugs. I think that's a beginning point there. And then I think in terms of the law enforcement in
Wow, I think I lost you. Hello. Chat. I lost you. Hello. Fuck. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Yes, I lost you for a second.
Okay.
Okay, so I was yeah. So
You-
let's finish. Let's finish this. Can you please tell us about where can we find the name of your book one more time? Can you reach behind you,
yes,
show it
yes.
to us, and tell us where
So,
we can find it? I think you gave us
yeah,
so much
yeah.
information.
So my books is my, a couple of my books is my first book, my latest book, El Narco, and the new book, Blood Gun Money. And they're on Amazon, on all big booksellers, straight from the publisher Bloomsbury. You can also see my website, www.ioangrillo, IOANGRILLO.com. You can see links to it there. And I'm around on Twitter, a little bit on Facebook, and around on bit on YouTube. So around different social media, and yeah, great to be in touch with people and hear everyone's ideas and opinions about how to try and solve this thing, how to improve this. And so there's less violence, less problems in this, less people dying of drug overdoses, less people dying of bullets than there have been in the last 20 years.
Wow, thank you so much, Jan. So this has been mind-blowing. This information is just
Yeah.
so incredible. It's just yeah, I'm so grateful for your time.